All Happy Inventor videos are for educational purposes only. Welcome to the Happy Inventor. Today we're going to be looking at space station designs and actually inventing a space station. And not just any space station, but an extremely large space station. So large that in fact we probably won't see this particular design ever made in our lifetime, and probably not in the next 100 or 200 years. However, it is possible to build this space station I'm going to show you, and we're going to go through some of the design parameters that will be kind of surprising for you. And if you remember, in the last episode we talked about the O'Neill cylinder and how expensive it was and how impractical it would be to actually try and make one of those for people to live on. This space station, on the other hand, will have a cost per person much lower than the O'Neill cylinder, and that is the goal of this particular space station, which I'm going to call the RAGNER cylinder. And I'm using the RAGNER cylinder instead of another name I have for it because I want to surprise you with some of the statistics. And if I gave you the name that I call it, you would know a little bit ahead of time what I'm planning to do with it. Now, I also in the last episode was going to talk about transverse space stations, but kind of ran out of time. And now I'm looking to extend that episode into the future a little bit because I want to put it just before my discussion of the Starship that SpaceX is making at the moment and how I'm going to be able to turn that into a transverse rotating space station very effectively and at probably very low cost and weight. And so we'll be looking at that several episodes from now. But for right now, we're going to be looking at the RAGNER cylinder and hopefully considering the costs, benefits of that design, and it's going to be surprising, some of the things you're going to see. Before I discuss the RAGNER cylinder, I want to take a look at some other spacecraft and space stations for comparison purposes. And these are going to be the Starship Enterprise, the Babylon 5 space station, and we're going to review the O'Neill cylinder and some of the factors involved in that particular space station. Now, for the Starship Enterprise, we find that if we look at the data for it, it's supposed to weigh 190,000 tons, which equates to about 442 tons per person. This is relatively reasonable and makes it a spacecraft that could actually exist. It's supposed to have a crew of 430, and that's how we get that number of 442 tons per person. It had a length of almost 1,000 feet, a width of 417 feet, and a height of 238 feet, and sported a crew of 430 people. Now, that equated to approximately 216 square meters per person. We could make it smaller, but I think that's a reasonable number. So the Starship Enterprise actually has some statistics that are reasonable as far as weight and size and space for the people working there. And if you watch the episodes, you can tell that the hallways are normally fairly empty, and that would make sense if everyone has over 2,000 square feet of space to live in. You're not going to see people all the time. You're going to be in different rooms and things like that. Now let's look at the Babylon 5 station, which is considerably larger than the Starship Enterprise and is quoted as being 5 miles long and appears to be about a mile in diameter, and is composed sort of an O'Neill cylinder with a Brinell sphere on the end. And we're going to approximate that with just making it a complete O'Neill cylinder, which is a very good approximation of that space station. The Babylon 5 space station is quoted as having 250,000 people living on it and weighing 2.5 million tons, which works out to about 10 tons per person. Now, on first calculation, 10 tons per person is not even reasonable because the Babylon 5 station is so large that just the atmosphere inside the station with 250,000 people represents 90 tons per person just for the air inside of it, not counting the space station at all. So obviously it's much greater than that, and when I calculated it, I came up with a little over 400 tons per person for that particular space station. Now, this did give the people around 1,720 square feet of living space per person, which is a reasonable amount of living space. But when you look at the videos, you see that Babylon 5 always appears to be very crowded, even though everyone has about 1,700 square feet of living space or floor space, and not counting having multi-story buildings. So it could be relatively empty except for high traffic areas such as malls and things like that. The O'Neill cylinder is even larger at 20 miles long and 5 miles in diameter, and having an estimated mass of 13 billion tons. Now this works out to about 2,000 tons per person, and that's assuming the entire interior is used for living space. For the original O'Neill cylinders, he had 2 cylinders counter-rotating to balance the rotational inertia of the system, and half the surface area was windows to allow sunlight in and radiant heat to exit. Now, both of these stations would require a lot of mass per person, and the original O'Neill cylinder estimated about 6,000 square feet per person, so that about 4,000 or 5,000 square feet could be used for growing food. And this is a reasonable thing to do, to grow your food on the station. But this bumps the cost up well over $1 billion per person. And this is not something that we can afford at this time. Maybe when we each have 10,000 robots working for us, we have a $1 billion income that we can afford to have a luxury condo in space. But until then, we have to reduce that cost. And so now we're going to look at the RAGNER cylinder, which is an attempt to greatly reduce the cost of actually having a home up in space. If you're enjoying this video, please hit the like and subscribe buttons right now. This way you won't miss any of the future content on these subjects. And now, back to inventing. This drawing shows the general structure of the RAGNER cylinder, with multiple concentric tori formed inside of one another. And this structure is designed to provide some safety, where each tori is sort of a self-contained living area. And you see here in this example only 2 tori, an inner torus that's right here and an outer torus that is formed around it. And essentially these tori have the shape of a pipe, where the walls of the pipe are hollow. And inside these walls, each torus has multiple floor decks, and you see many of them right here. And those are supporting people and have condos or shops or things like that. And we're going to discuss those in just a little bit. The outer torus here does not have any floors in it yet. They haven't been built, and they would also contain living space. And so the RAGNER cylinder is basically very different from the O'Neill cylinder in that it populates the entire volume of the space station, while the O'Neill cylinder only populates the outer edge or surface of the cylinder. And so we can get many more people in a RAGNER cylinder than we can into an O'Neill cylinder. The outer shell on a RAGNER cylinder is the strongest portion of the cylinder. And that is because it not only has to support all the air pressure that's inside, but it has to support the mass of people, the actual radiation shielding, and the external radiation shielding and debris shielding. And so all that mass, as it's rotating, has to be supported by this outer shell. And so that outer shell is going to be generally about 1 meter thick or more, and provides a good radiation shielding itself, and also the structure to hold the cylinder or torus in its shape. Now the inner rings or tori can have thinner shells because, one, they're supported by air pressure on both sides, and because the gravity is reducing as you go in towards the center of the RAGNER cylinder. And this provides very low weight but safety for the people, because if one cylinder or one torus loses pressure, the people in that torus can move to one of the other ones that has not lost pressure for safety. And hopefully you can repair a torus that's been punctured before you lose all the atmosphere, because we're talking about a lot of atmosphere if you lose it. So a lot of safety systems should be employed to keep the atmosphere from being lost. I'm not going to talk too much about the radiation shielding here for the RAGNER cylinder, because it is essentially the same as for the O'Neill cylinder or any other space body, and the 10-ton rule is a good rule to follow. That is, 10 tons of radiation shielding per square meter provides very good shielding independent of what material you use. And you can see this in the fact that we have approximately 10 tons of air above us to protect us from cosmic radiation. And a nuclear reactor uses about 4 meters of concrete, or about 10 tons per square meter, to protect people from radiation coming out of the reactor core. So this 10 tons per square meter is a good rule. Of course, every material has a little bit different interaction with radiation, and some materials are better than others. Liquid hydrogen being probably about 50% better than most materials, but hydrogen has the problem of being a liquid and can leak from containers very quickly, and needs to be contained at a cryogenic temperature, which is also very difficult because of the very low temperature of liquid hydrogen, and so really is sort of impractical for a space station. And so generally we'll use something like water or polyethylene that has a lot of hydrogen in it to provide the radiation protection we're looking for. And so generally we are going to provide the radiation protection with materials like that and not liquid hydrogen. The exterior shielding is used to protect the space station from debris and impacts from outside. And this is very, very important, and it needs to be able to stop different sized projectiles that are coming in at hypervelocity and prevent it from puncturing the outer shell and causing a depressurization of the space station. And to do that, I have come up with this structure, which is very similar to what NASA uses. You have a very thin outer layer that is designed to basically explode smaller projectiles or debris up to about 1 centimeter in diameter. And those pieces of debris, as they hit this 1 millimeter thick layer, essentially explode into vapor. And as a rule of thumb, about 300 times spacing between that layer and the next layer that has to absorb that explosion is a good rule of thumb. So 1 millimeter, if you multiply 1 millimeter times 300, you get 30 centimeters. And so about a foot distance between this 1 millimeter layer and the next one that has to survive that explosion. And if we make this layer 1 centimeter thick or 10 times thicker, it's going to require about 3 meters of space between it and the next layer, so that the explosion from, say, a 10 centimeter diameter piece of debris has room to explode and expand before it hits this next layer. Now, this 10 centimeter layer, again 10 times thicker, is designed to be able to obliterate things up to 1 meter in diameter. And of course, we're going to need even more space for that explosion, because that's going to be a serious explosion, something 1 meter in diameter. And I've marked it here for 30 meters, which is reasonable. And that explosion would have to be stopped by the main hull, which is in yellow here. We call it the outer shell in many of the charts and the spreadsheets also. And generally this main hull or outer shell is about 1 meter thick, so it's very, very strong. And so it would take a really significant explosion 30 meters away to actually cause damage to this main hull. And so that's the idea of having layered protection. Now, anything larger than 1 meter in diameter that impacting the station would hopefully have some space defense that would see these large projectiles coming and do something about changing their course or obliterating them before they reach the space station. And that's another way of protecting ourselves. Now, can we use the space between the main hull and the first or third impact shield? This is very strong. At 10 centimeters of stainless steel or some other material could support this area, and we're talking about a large volume, so maybe we want to use that. Here I have water tanks to absorb the neutrons coming off of the steel, because 10 centimeters of steel actually is going to spew out a lot of neutrons, and you're actually going to have more radiation on this side of the steel than you would on this side of the steel. And so you need to absorb those neutrons. I'm using water here, but it could be polyethylene layer right here to absorb those neutrons, so that the radiation hazard in this area is not outrageous, but it wouldn't be someplace you would want to live. It's someplace you could walk into to repair something, but you wouldn't want to stay there for a long period of time, like years. So something like this could be used, this space, but the gravity here, because it's 30 meters, you're talking about a little bit added gravity due to the rotation of the spacecraft and the slightly larger diameter of this surface compared to the actual main hull of the space station. Looking at a RAGNER cylinder, and this is what I'm calling a RAGNER cylinder, it's 10 kilometers in diameter and 60 kilometers long. So not a small thing, 6 miles by about 37 miles. So like a small town. And notice on this particular spreadsheet, I've increased the accuracy of the RPM, because what I'm going to do up here is I'm going to see how much greater the acceleration is going to be if I add 30 meters of radius to the space station. And you notice the RPM changed, and it went from 0.2423 to 0.4217. And so the RPM is slowed down because we increased the diameter. But we're not concerned with the RPM, we're more concerned with the rate of rotation. And so I'm going to add 0.1%, and that was not enough. Let's go to 0.5%. We're getting very close to our original number. How about a 6? There's exactly the same RPM. So by adding 30 meters of radius, we are adding about 6 thousandths or 0.6% to the acceleration, going from 9.81 to 9.87 meters per second squared. So not significant. It's not enough that anyone would probably even notice that there's a difference. However, if we change this diameter, our RPM changes to 0.94584, and at 1G, that is almost a little over a mile in diameter. So we add the 30 meters of radius, we see the rotation speed has changed, and I'm going to guess a 2% increase in gravitational acceleration. And we're almost there, but not quite. Let's go to 3%. Try that. And there is the exact same number. And so mathematically, if we add those 30 meters to the outside of a 2-kilometer diameter space station, we are going to get about 3% more gravity. And now 3% is still going to be very hard to detect, because most people wear about 4 pounds of clothing, and this is representing on a 200-pound person. 3% is only 6 pounds of added weight. So almost the same weight that you add when you put on heavy clothing like jeans and a sweatshirt and shoes. You're adding almost the same amount that you would add to your mass by going out to this outer rim. And so that's not going to affect anyone very much and not going to be a problem. And so perfectly workable that people could work in that environment for short periods of time with the radiation. Now here we see just the outer ring, or what I'm calling an outer torus. Structurally it's a torus shape, an elongated torus, hollow in the middle. And this structure has multiple floors in it. And these floors are going to be hung from the inner surface. And what that does is actually provide the mass to kind of hold this in place against air pressure. For example, if we lost air pressure in here, this inner part of the torus would want to collapse down if nothing else were holding it up, because it's no longer a circular shape to support itself. It's just basically a flat cylinder that would want to crush under air pressure or expand out towards the center under air pressure. Now the outside here is a cylinder, so that's not going to want to expand, but this coming out this way is a problem. And so what we have to do to prevent that expansion, should we lose air pressure on one side, is to actually put some supports in here. And you have supports going from the outer to the inner part of the torus. Essentially, these floors are being hung from this inner layer going down, and that's a much more efficient means of supporting a structure than trying to build it from the ground up. Everyone knows that it takes more structural material to hold something up than it does to hang it from a ceiling. And so that's the reason the RAGNER cylinder is built this way, that all the flooring is built down from the top, not up from the bottom. And this structure here can be as simple as walls that are extended within the torus, and essentially each one of these would be a ring of material that goes around the torus supporting it, and would have a certain spacing so that this inner wall could not collapse inward. Even if this became a vacuum in here, the air pressure and the mass of all this structure would be enough to hold this inner ring in place and not be damaged because of loss of pressure in another torus. And so that provides us a lot of extra safety in that each torus, the outer or even the inner torus, is self-supporting and can contain its pressure and still have vacuum on the inside and on the outside and still be supported. And again, this scaffolding or this structure between the inside and outside of the torus can have very many different structures. These could be cylindrical tubes that go from the inside to the outside and provide the structure that way, or they might be walls, they might be strips of stainless steel hanging down that all the buildings and flooring is attached to. Many different ways of constructing this interior so that it is hanging, I'd be looking down here, hanging down in this direction from the top, but still connected so that the outer shell here and the inner ring are connected so that if air pressure is lost in here, this layer, this ring cannot expand inward. It is held in place by all this structure that is supporting all the flooring in the RAGNER cylinder. One more thing before we go on to looking at the spreadsheet is that the floor spacing inside these tori can be adjusted in the spreadsheet, as well as the distance between the top and bottom of the torus. And that allows us to adjust the floor spacing and also spacing of the tori. And this gives us a little bit more control to find out, as more tori increase the mass significantly for the space station, what is the optimal spacing between the inner and outer surface of the tori. And so we're now going to go look at the spreadsheet and calculate some of these factors. This is the spreadsheet I used for calculating the parameters for the RAGNER cylinder. And you can see here that I've entered the 10,000 meters by 60,000 meters for the size of the RAGNER cylinder. And note that a little over 6 miles in diameter by 37 miles is slightly larger than the O'Neill cylinder, which is 5 miles in diameter and 20 miles long. But it is in the same class as the O'Neill cylinder, and we are going to be comparing it to the O'Neill cylinder. Now, before I actually calculate the number of people that can live on this space station, I want to look at a few of these parameters, and I'm afraid I'm going to be running out of time, so I'm going to go through these really quickly, and then in the next episode we'll continue on and actually discuss how many people can fit on this space station and how long people can survive without life supports. And so remember, each one of these white boxes you can fill with whatever number you want. I'm putting a safety margin of 3 for the outer shell, which is the portion of the space station that holds everything together, and a margin of error of 2 for the inner shells, which make up the inner tori. And this margin is not its normal operating margin, but during emergencies, when one of the tori next to it has lost air pressure and the stresses on it suddenly go up, this is the safety margin for that condition, not for the normal operating condition. And I also get to choose the spacing of the floors and the spacing of the shells. And the spacing of the floors basically tell you how high your ceiling is going to be, and 3 meters is approximately 10 feet. So if you have a floor that's 1 foot thick, that gives you about 8.5 to 9 feet of space, head space, on that floor, which is a nice amount of space for people to live in. And the 250 meters is the spacing or the height of each one of these tori. And you might be thinking 250 meters, that's a really high ceiling for that tori, and you were right, because actually I calculate how many floors on each of the shells, and we see that we have 83 floors on each one of these shells with that spacing. And if you do the math, you'll find out that that's actually correct, how many floors you can put on there. And notice that how many tori can we actually have? Well, we got 17 plus 1, 2, 3, so we have 20 tori in our space station here. This drawing only shows 2 tori, just so that you can see them. But for this diameter space station and for this spacing of the tori, you're going to have 20 tori going around this space station. And so a lot of floors, we're talking about lots of space, and next time we're going to look at this, and I'm going to press this button, and it's going to tell us how many people can actually live on that space station. And until then, keep inventing.